We're here for the OI Bellwether Lecture of this term. I notice from the definition of bellwether that actually the bellwether apparently is the lead sheep in a flock. I always thought it was something to do with elections, but apparently it is indeed just the sort of like the leader of trends, sort of follow it into the future. And we've always seen bellwether lectures in this sense that we want to bring to you not just, if you like, some of the sort of world-leading intellectuals in our field to Oxford for you to have a chance to listen to, but leading intellectuals who are speaking on topics of immense contemporary relevance and importance. I'll talk a little bit more to give a proper introduction to Barbara in a moment, but I didn't want to interrupt that with the housekeeping, so maybe let's deal with that first. First of all, this is not Chatham House. You are welcome to tweet. I think the OII Oxford hashtag, sorry, OII Oxford, at OII Oxford, is the one to use if you're referring to us. Do you have a Twitter handle you'd like used? At?
No.
No, okay, that's fine, that's absolutely fine. But if I can just ask, please, if you turn your mobile phones to silent or off so we don't get lots of annoying alarms. Speaking of alarms, we don't have any fire alarms planned this evening, so if we hear one, we will need to leave the building. Just make your way through the exits. Apparently there are lots of Running Man symbols on the floor outside, which we can all try and find, and there should be some stewards to help us. So, housekeeping over, let's get on to the meat of the evening. As I said, we're really delighted to have Barbara here this evening. She's a professor in the Division of Communication Theory and Media Effects at the Freie Universität of Berlin. But I think even more interestingly, she's also a professor at the new Weizenbaum Institute for the Network Society in Berlin and Brandenburg. And this is super interesting to us at the OII because this is a new multidisciplinary institute dedicated to understanding the implications of digital technologies on all aspects of life. So we're delighted not just to hear Barbara, but to have you here, if you like, as a sort of diplomat from this new partner institute that we look forward to working with more in the future. Barbara's going to talk to us tonight on a topic, as I said, of great relevance. I think one of my frustrations often is that we look at the impact of new technologies on politics and on democracy, but we do so often in the vacuum without thinking also of the sort of underlying political changes and social changes within which those technologies are developing. And I'm delighted to see that the talk that you're giving tonight, Digital Dissonance, Disconnection and Noise, is going to cover both of those together. So without further ado, Barbara, I think we've got about 45-50 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions after that before the reception. So if I can invite you up, and can we give a round of applause, please? Thank you.
All right. Okay, you hear me? Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here and speak to you. Yes, I am a principal investigator at the newly founded Weizenbaum Institute, but actually I'm also curious to learn from the role model here in Oxford. So I'm very happy that this talk is the first step into this great relationship that we are going to work on. Starting about the topic I'm talking tonight, there are plenty occasions which urge us social scientists to really think about the state of democracy and the state of communication, and also reconsider some of our fundamental paradigms of research. So, for instance, if you look at the pictures, in the light of American textbooks of government, who would have believed some time ago that the country is governed by the Twitter communication of a businessman whose constant messages are based on misinformation? Or in the light of the history of European media, who would have believed that the public television stations and the quality press are threatened by the algorithms of commercial internet industry? And who would have believed that dubious niche media, which live up of conspiracy theory and narrowcasting, motivate large crowds to march on the streets and calling to hang elected politicians, as has happened in Dresden, Germany? So one could go on with many episodes and accounts of what goes wrong in current political communication. But this is not the occasion about episodes. This is the occasion to maybe be more skeptic and analyze what we observe from a social science point of view, and this is exactly what I wish to do tonight. My thesis is that contemporary liberal democracy is under stress, which I see as an unintended consequence of two long-term changes, one in political culture and one in public communication. And I will first deal with these changes in the first section of my talk, and then argue that dissonant, noisy, and disconnected public spheres have emerged in these hybrid media systems. Then I will be going on and look at political communication under those premises and look at actors, modes, and spaces of communication before I come to the consequences. The consequences, which I think are unintended consequences, and I will look at the consequences in terms of what happens in journalism and what happens in political campaigning, and then in the very end reflect on what it means for democracy. And this will be the hardest part. Anyway, so let me start with the long-term changes in political culture and information infrastructures. Now, if we talk about democracy, we have to kind of consider that the link between democracy and communication is ingrained in the cultural and attitudinal mechanisms of democratic systems. How political institutions work and how they are acted out is depending on how smoothly communication between political actors and citizens goes, and this is the issue of political culture, how well democratic norms and values are internalized through communication. So I will be starting with this later point and looking at political spaces, political cultures, and political parties. So my first point is that problems of contemporary democracy are problems of political culture. And according to political culture theory, democratic practice can be measured and can be analyzed if we look at the values of democratic conduct and at the values of the citizens. And here we have some quite interesting recent studies about the formation of values in Western democracy, and also some nice studies about political spaces. So interestingly enough, recent research, empirical research, points to a crisis of liberal democracies, which not only is somewhere, but is in the middle of Western Europe and particularly in those countries which so far stood for very stable political institutions and democratic rule. So the crisis of democracy is usually measured with three indicators: the degree to which anti-system parties and movements emerge, the degree of popular support for democracy as a system of government, and the degree to which the democratic rules are accepted. Let me start by anti-system parties. A recent study, which will be published this summer by Hutter and Grisi, shows nicely that during the last decades, the European liberal democracies have undergone a profound transformation of national political spaces, which are expressed in new cleavages and new conflicts. These transformations brought up new challenges and new challenger parties, which in almost all countries have threatened the order of the political mainstream parties. New conflict lines linked to very long-term cultural and value change on the one hand, and on globalization and denationalization on the other hand, are held responsible for these changes. And Hutter and Grisi argue that the economic crisis 10 years ago fueled this political crisis and in a way enhanced the reconfiguration of national party systems. The democracies of Northern and Western Europe, as opposed to Southern Europe and Central Europe, have witnessed a continual erosion of mainstream parties who lost voters to challenger parties that mobilized those voters who felt neglected from them. Also, these countries faced the decline of the traditional class cleavage, which meant that the moderate left has been moving to the right, while the moderate right has been moving to the left. Creasy and Hutter find that the UK and Germany are in a way parallel cases, so that the reshuffling of political conflict in those two countries resulted what they call a crisis of representation, in which the mainstream parties suffered from an increasing remoteness of their voters, a decline of mobilizing capacity, and a rise of populist challengers. In both countries, they argue, the challenger mobilized on immigration and EU integration, and in both countries, mainstream parties reacted by decreasing the salience of the European issue. In both countries, the success of, in Germany, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, and in the UK, the UKIP, they argue, increased the politicization of cultural issues and strengthened intra-party disagreement. So this is the situation in our countries. Creasy and Hutter also argue that in Southern European and Central European countries, there was a different situation, but these countries or these areas also suffered from high levels of political conflict and a remobilization of cultural issues and identity politics, which threatened, they argue, the political order. So the political space has been changing as a consequence of globalization on the one hand and on the economic crisis. The second indicator for the crisis of democracy is the declining support of democracy as a political order. And here we can cite the studies of Foer and Monk, who wrote that they find it deeply concerning that in their data, they find that a number of people who have been disenchanted by the democracy as a political order has increased particularly. And they find that people become more cynical about the value of democracy as a political system. And what is even more kind of concerning is that quite numerous people, according to their data, express support for authoritarian alternatives. So in political culture research, the decline of support for democracy is also measured with different indicators, and the Foer and Monk study gives a lot of indicators that corroborate their interpretation that democracy is in serious crisis. And what is most puzzling in their data is that the cohort of 16 to 25-year-olds are considerably more skeptic about democracy than the older generations. Young people are somewhat less eager to insist on free and fair elections. Young people are less inclined to be politically interested, so that the researchers find a quickly widening generation gap in political apathy. So in previous research, and we have long taken for granted that the younger generations who shy away from established politics would become more active in non-conventional political activities, in movements and issue-driven activities. But Foer and Monk also find that this pattern no longer holds true, and that participation in new social movements has also declined among the younger generations. Finally, they also find that the generation gap is there as regards the subjective affection with democracy as a form of government and skepticism towards liberal institutions. So Again, we have indicators that there is a crisis which is particularly widespread among the young. Now there are different other studies who try to also prove whether there is a serious legitimacy crisis. And there's a recent study by Fuchs and Roller, which is going to be published this summer, who work with different data. And they are more reticent and cautious with their interpretation of a severe legitimacy crisis. However, they also find an erosion of trust in democracy, and they find in particularly that the satisfaction with democracy is fueled in a negative way by attitudes towards immigration. So the more people feel threatened of the negative consequences of immigration, the less satisfied they are with democracy. So these researchers deny a general crisis. However, they also find a considerable preference for autocratic values in Western democracy. So they interpret their findings that there is a potential for authoritarian leadership which only needs to be exploited, they write, by the populist parties. So this is the long-term developments in political culture. And the question is, what does this have to do with communication? But I would be claiming that we can only look at the long-term dynamics in political culture by also looking at the structure of public communication, because I think that any political expression in any democratic practice is dependent on how it is communicated in the public, by the people, to the people, so that I will combine these findings with also reflection on the changes of the political communication infrastructure. And here we can follow, first of all, the typology of J. Blumler, which you might know, who spoke of 4 ages of political communication, when the first stage was characterized through a dominant pattern of party communication and government communication in an environment of strong voter loyalties. The second age was the age of television and professionalization of election campaigning. And since the 2000, J. Blumler says we have reached a third stage of communication, which is signified by the introduction of the internet, but also by the multi-channel television, which is now being more commercialized and more plural than before, and by the rise of political marketing. Now, J. Blumler has kind of reconsidered his writings and now would argue that we are now in a fourth age of political communication since 2010, which he calls a period of encompassing communication abundance set off by the affordances of Web 2.0, which entails an enormous increase of complexity. And at the same time, and this is the worrisome part of this stage, the public and the quality media have lost their legitimization as dominant channel of political communication. So it's not just that new affordances allow for many new public spaces of communication, but also the traditional legitimized information channels suffer from a serious threat. So next to traditional media, there is a completely new infrastructure of communication, and this will be now my topic, how this new infrastructure is threatening the old infrastructure and also has changed the political debate. Now, if we look at communication today, we need to take into account both systems in a way, and this idea is nicely taken up by Andrew Chadwick's writings, which refers to the interaction of old and new media in political communication, and to what he calls a hybrid media system. So he would argue that the interaction of legacy media and digital platforms in technology, in genre, in norms, in behaviors, in organization produces an environment of a hybrid media system. And in this communication ecology, the position of the traditional media is seriously threatened and challenged. Chadwick argues that elite communication increasingly integrates this new practices and new affordances in new dynamics and in agenda building and mobilization, but still it's not quite clear how this interaction of old and new media, of political actors and traditional mass media, of new actors that are being brought into the communication, plus the diverse and differentiated communication environment really interact. However, the new information infrastructure includes a vast multitude of channels and a high dispersion of actors. And this also means that new spaces of public communication emerge. Here, the hybrid media system emerges, and they structure the political debate. And this also kicks off a new economy of attention in the overall society, which would be Matt Hindman's argument, who argues that the reduction of costs and through the permanent changes of role and production and consumption of information, the number of information grows enormous, while the attention must be shared at the same time. So we have new conditions that also carries new roles and new mechanisms of attentions. And in the end, we must not forget that these mechanisms of attentions are not just a matter of political debate, but they are also a matter of business, as social media in their very nature are commercially driven advertisement tools where data and attention are traded for commercial clients. So this is the situation in the infrastructure and the long-term developments. What does this have to do now, or how can we bring this together now with democracy? And my suggestion is to look at these changes and revisit, first of all, theory. And this is when concepts come in, concepts of public sphere come in, because I think the linkage between political debate on the one hand, political culture and infrastructure is nicely brought together in writings on the public sphere. Now, public sphere denotes an area within which communication channels for citizens are being provided and used. And in distinction to public space, the public sphere concept is strongly linked with the normative idea of Habermas, who sees the public sphere as a space of deliberation, a space where the best solution on issues, including their normative underpinnings, are being deliberated. So this normative concept is not only a functional system of communication, but also comes with this idea of intermediation between the formally organized institutions in the society and informal face-to-face deliberations in areas at the top and at the bottom of the political system. And one major function of the Habermasian public sphere is that it's a forum of public speech, ideal public speech and rational discourse based on arguments, and very important, the deliberations should end in a binding consensus, which is thought of as basis of decision-making of the political system. So Dean maintains that the public sphere necessarily, the Habermasian public sphere, necessarily is there to function to reach a consensus in society. In his more recent writings, as you know, Habermas underlines that the ideal speech is not face-to-face speech, but that it's given, or that the quality press does play a role in this deliberation, and that the quality press acts as functional equivalent space of sorting out public communication. But if we consider the changes I've been talking about, the crisis of the legacy media, it becomes very clear that the quality press can no longer function in this role of mediation. So we have to think about another model of a public sphere, and Van Dijk and Hacker quite recently argues that the Habermas public sphere is no longer valid in network society. So we need to find another model, and my idea was that we understand or use a model of Chantal Mouffe, who takes into account that societies are not only places where you have rational deliberations, but also that societies consist of antagonistic interests, of power relations, of perpetual conflict that is always expressed publicly. So Chantal Mouffe and other authors like Fenton and Downey and others would play into the foreground the idea that the public sphere is a space where conflicts are being brought to the fore, where conflicts of marginalization, of expropriation, of racism and polarization and crisis are at the center of the stage, or as Grisi and Hutter would say, the crisis of political representation plays out. Downey and Fenton in their writings stress that the polyvocality of the public sphere entails the coming to fore of counter-publics, and that the space is a space full of discursive contestation, as they would write. So these theories do not consider the consensus like Habermas, but this theory acknowledge the pluralistic nature of public sphere and its conflicts and its stress and its ruptures, and much more than the normative goal of consensus. And in this light of the argument, I and my colleagues propose that we call this arena of public debate a dissonant public sphere, because I like that the term alludes to music theory and the nature of polyvocality, incompatible sounds and shrill disharmony, which violates the desire of the audience for chromatic harmony. So, as the real-world communication of Donald Trump or the Brexit campaign show, dissonant public spheres abstain from rational arguments in the Habermasian sense or reference to other. They inspire neither to understand, nor deliberate, nor seek consensus. Instead, we observe increasing levels of noise, fractured actor constellation, parallel issue agendas, and diverging contradictory opinion over fundamental conflicts and representation crises in society. And as digitalization penetrates society more deeply, we need to bring this together with the communication infrastructure. And so we can argue that the internet can be seen as the driver of furthermore dissonance in public spheres, and that the driver potential can be ascribed to its technical potential on the one hand, but also its social appropriation. So both aspects have increased, I would argue, to more polyvocality, to a cacophony of voices, of noises, and in a way we have to somehow deal with this quality of public communication. Now, around the idea of dissonant public sphere, there is an argument about networks And in earlier times, you can go to the writings, for instance, of Benkler. It was argued that network public spheres are more responsive and are a good thing because they are more diverse and they provide broader inclusion, participatory filtering, and good platforms for public concerns. Quite recently, the scholarship on media connectivity has argued the contrary. For instance, Sylvia Weisbrot argues that this perspective of the networks overlook the network's potential for disconnections, not the connections, but the disconnections. And in Sylvia's view, a world of mediated connections coexists with multiple disconnections. And he asked that we need to not look at the connections, but rather turn our view and turn our focus from studying connections to studying disconnections. And he would argue that media technologies, institutions, and cultures are not only agents of connections, but rather agents of disconnections. So we have this twofold quality of the public sphere, which is dissonant on the one hand, and it's also filled with disconnection. And to conclude this part on the concepts, I would say those ideas of dissonance and disconnection help us to investigate the democratic will formation and how democracy is acted out in such a precarious context, as I would say. So the result of this situation are asymmetries in public debate, emerging on the basis of cleavages or demographic imbalances, and they play out in segmented spaces which are more or less noisy and disconnected. So far, so good. Now comes the difficult part of the speech, namely the outcome. So what is the outcome of this situation of cacophony and dispersion and polyvocality, as Dahlgren would call them? And in this analysis, I think we must be careful because it's very easy to engage in conspiracy theories. I would prefer to interpret the situation of public communication rather as unintended consequence of the interaction of these transformations which I have been describing. So when I'm now speaking about possible consequences of dissonant public spheres, I do not want that you understand me as if I would be spinning more conspiracy theories, but rather I would like to step back and look how the information flows are in a media-driven environment which slips away from authoritative information flows of traditional legacy media into the hybridity of digital media. Because it has become difficult to sort out the messages as right or wrong, sort out the messages as true and false, and it's even more difficult to single out messages which are manipulated by algorithm and artificial intelligence. So in this cacophony of multiple voices, which have become a permanent feature of public debate. That's the difference. It's not something that goes and comes, but I would argue this is now a permanent feature of public debate, and that we then must engage and look more closer how the actors react, what the tones and the linkages are of communication in this permanent situation. So before I finally come to democracy, I want to describe this dissonant public spheres, again with respect to three dimensions: actors, practices, and spaces. So First, to the actors in dissonant public spheres who are relevant to public debate and democracy. First of all, we notice that there are multiple actors from counter-publics, from civil societies, from network activists, from citizen journalists, from lay people who engage in public speech and advocating their cause in public. And at the same time, journalists have lost their monopoly. And I think this losing of monopoly of professional journalists must not be underestimated, because it really turns the sorting out of public debate upside down. So this clear division of performance roles in public debate, which were relevant for kind of sorting out arguments on a professional basis, is I think a real significant change which comes to the dissonant public sphere. However, there are also new actors that slip into secondary performance roles, citizen journalists. There are also new roles like data breach hunters. There are also new roles of technicians who are able to do some professional programming of algorithms and bots. And so in this array of different new actors, we have to see how they really interact, and how they define their new role in public debate. But the first argument here is clear, that this huge array of actors, this actor repertoire, is a real challenge for public debate. Plus, there are not only national actors, but also foreign actors who interfere into national campaigns. So it's diverse and confusing, and we cannot hold anybody responsible anymore, as we could hold journalists responsible for what they were writing. And this also means that there is a fundamental doubt about what information can be trusted, what is rumors and what is lies. There is also new practices in dissonant public spheres. The noise level sets also a new stage for communication. Political coalitions are built via online issue networks, which are hyperlink networks about a particular issue. But dissonant public sphere not only entails those new politically motivated interactions in online issue networks, but also new tones, new eruptions of hate speech and ideological speech, and also dubious practices of information, rumor, and conspiracy. So we cannot trust anymore that in dissonant public spheres we have professional practices of sorting out information, but rather we must mistrust the information we are getting, because what is public is not automatically true. So dissonant public spheres are open for manipulation and also economic and political exploitation from dubious campaigns. And you are very familiar with this picture, which is an example for this space of public sphere and its manipulation. In the latest House of Commons report on misinformation, which investigates the Cambridge Analytica scandal, it is nicely demonstrated that public sphere now also happens in networks where the political campaigns are linked to databases of registered voters the American presidential campaign and also a network of organizations funded by the Koch brothers. So we have new forms of networks and new spaces and practices of public communication. Spaces of communication. Here it is maybe worth mentioning that the space of dissonant public spheres is the virtual reality of networked space, and the speakers don't necessarily know each other as their communication is practiced online and only virtual. So communicators operate on the web, on niche platforms which are sometimes below the threshold that can be made visible and made transparent. It is certainly below the norms of discursiveness, and it certainly violates the norm of transparency and discursiveness nor attention. We have personalized alternative public spheres in which people traffic rumors, in which bots, trolls, hacking institutions are being involved from outside, and so the manufacturing of disinformation, and this is the frightening news, has become a business model. And there are new actors, political actors, that interfere in this public sphere, which are not legitimate in the very sense of political actors, which is the internet industry. So we have new spaces, we have new practices, we have new actors. What does this mean? My first argument would be that this means that the media business itself is undergoing a severe change, and journalism is undergoing severe change. Journalism has lost its function and its binding to professional newsmaking and journalistic norms of accuracy of truth. Journalists are part of a multiple actor repertoire, but only part of it, and they no longer are the main actors. Also, the media businesses are no longer living off newsmaking. For example, the Axel Springer, largest German business publishing house, now makes 75% of the revenues from digital platforms, whether real estate, housing and dating platforms, while their former main business, namely publishing printed media, has gone very much down. So there is severe change in journalism as a profession and media as a business, and so we have lost the main agents of sorting out reliable, authoritative information flows, and this is, I think, quite a concern that quality journalism is expelled from their role of sorting out newsmaking, while journalists have to compromise with social media strategies of their publishing houses and their organizations. Now, this is one consequence, which the second consequence is that we are no longer operating in national public spaces. So a new feature of political communication which has become possible now is that foreign actors get directly involved in national political communication. And what you see here is this network I was speaking about. It's the network of Cambridge Analytica with a database of truth, with the Trump campaign, and with the Koch brothers funded organizations. And you see that they are all interlinked in this huge network of disinformation. And as the House of Commons report states, there has been clear and proven Russian influence in foreign election, and we highlighted evidence in our report of such attempts. So this committee is convinced that there is something to it, and that this network looks like as here being shown. So what they say is that the speed of technological development has coincided with a crisis of confidence in institutions and the media in the West, similar argument to mine, and this has enabled foreign countries and other actors on destabilizing democratic institutions and to taking advantage of the crisis. In their final statement, they say, the UK is clearly vulnerable to covert digital influence campaigns, and the government should be conducting analysis to understand the extent of the targeting of voters by foreign players during past elections. So this is also a fundamental change of public debate, and dissonant public sphere is not only a public sphere in which national actors argue over right or wrong arguments, it's also a platform or an arena where we have foreign players playing an important role in political campaign. So I'm finally coming to the end. What does it mean for democracy? These many trajectories of communication and political culture, which all point to some sort of crisis. So I think that the problem of the public sphere and the dissonant public sphere and the political crisis is that they mutually reinforce each other, and at the same time we are unable to separate causes and consequences. So we cannot isolate the factors which push the development. Since the consequences for democracy originating in long-term change of political culture and structure are so hard to separate from the conditions that are due to the changes of communication, we cannot really distinguish the causes and the consequences. Therefore, I think we should look at it as a result of unintended consequences and a temporary state of development in contemporary democracy. So my argument would be that we are in the middle of a transformation period in which we observe processes of de-alignment and realignment of democratic interfaces which play out in communication on the one hand, but also in political culture, in information ecologies, and in the behavior of audiences. What we can see clearly now is that different groups in democratic societies react differently to the situation in communication and the situation in politics. So I think in summarizing, we should not engage in making a general judgment on what is the consequences for democracy, but rather should take a differentiated look at different actors. So, for instance, political actors such as parties are affected by the dissonant public spheres as their competition has become much harder, and they have a hard time of processing not only public claims as such, but also the communication economy, and there's been increasing pressure for them to really react. A recent study by Lance Bennett, Segerberg and Knüpfer show that the parties, particularly the parties in the fringe role, try to adapt the new technologies and develop their organizations into connective parties. They use technologies for performing organizational functions in elections, but also operations where they relate to citizens. However, this study also shows that results are quite mixed. So success is not a given. So connective parties are not automatically successful or more successful than mainstream party, but rather the contrary. The parties suffer from a quite insecure environment in which they have hard time to handle public demands. And as they try to cope with the situation and integrate new technologies, at the same time they increase the noise, the uncertainty and the contradictions on the voter side as well as on the party itself. Now, governments have finally realized that digital platforms are not neutral, but powerful in their interface to public life. And in many countries, they have finally recognized that the internet industry is commercializing data of users and thereby become eminent players in real economy. There are many privacy questions, legal questions, which I will not discuss here, but eventually governments try to cope with the situation in their real or pretended efforts to regulate digital communication industry, as well as shield their citizens from manipulation through digital communication. As the recent report of the House Committee states, I quote, "There needs to be absolute transparency of online political campaigning, indicating the source of the advertiser. Moreover, the social media companies are called to be more transparent about their sites and their work." So they try to finally regulate the industry, for better or worse, and I'm not sure whether they can be successful at all. Among another group of actors in this environment are social movements. And here one can also cite the cyber transformation of the public sphere, which has been praised as a revolution for social movements. However, as many studies show of, for instance, for the Occupy Wall Street movement, connective action does not necessarily improve the effectiveness of social movements. Instead, what we see is that they also increase the noise in the public, and it is not sure whether connective action really helps them to develop their effectiveness. Finally, what is more important is the legacy media, which have become the most threatened institutions in the dissonant public sphere. They suffer from audiences turning away from their media, and also audiences that distrust them as an institution. So, as the House of Commons states, the audiences need to be educated, because that's the only way they think that can help to strengthen the interface between the media and its audiences. However, what we can see is that these measures of education of audiences are very long-term, and that we may not expect short-term relief of the effects of dissonant public sphere. So I cannot give you relief, but rather state that we are in a very midst of a long-term process of communication as well as change, and this will not go away pretty soon. So thank you for listening to my...
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. It actually reminds me of some very early lectures that we had at the OAI. We had a professor of e-democracy in the early years. In fact, Bill, you'll remember, when we had Stephen Coleman. And one of the ideas he propounded very early on was that in that era, which was the era of reality TV, things like Big Brother House, that actually the way to re-engage young people with politics was to make politics more like reality TV, to make it more responsive, more emotional, more dramatic. And I think in many ways what you've given us an account of today is precisely a description of a new political system where technology and political change is combined in a way to give us what Stephen asked for. I think he thought it'd be a good thing, but I think it's very clear from the analysis you presented that it's really not. We have time for some questions. So we have people with microphones. So yes, if you'd like to ask Barbara a question, stick up your hand and one of my lovely staff will come over. Over to Ralph, please.
very much. It's great, and you know, I agree with a lot of it, and I think the idea of dissonant public sphere is great. But I'd like you to expand a little bit on the two cases that you mentioned, Brexit and Germany. Oh, sorry, you disappeared. You know, the reason for mentioning those is that you're talking about transnational forces. But if we just take those two countries, some of the leading media setting the agenda are public service, still, BBC in Germany, and also the leading national newspapers. And, you know, I very much like what you say about the fact that those are losing authority, but, you know, you talked about irrationality, you talked about, you know, different groups contesting this. But one way to see the rise of right-wing populists in both countries in particular is simply to say, well, they really, and that's something that you didn't expand on, they simply say that the agenda nationally set by these dominant public service actors and by the traditional media is not something that we like. And we simply have our own alternatives, whether it's Breitbart or blogs or Facebook groups and so on. And that doesn't strike me as being dissonant, and it doesn't strike me as being something that we should think about as being irrational or influenced by disinformation. I think one somewhat different way of interpreting that, and I don't know if you'd agree with that, simply to say, well, you know, these are people who, in relation to the economic crisis or immigration, have a radically different view. It's not my personal view at all. But, you know, to understand it as this kind of challenge, this alternative with new media, simply against what those groups would see as, you know, the dominant view which they simply don't like. I wonder how you think about that.
Yes, well, of course, I mean, for instance, in the Thesis study, he demonstrates that the mainstream parties really kind of tune down the agenda of those feeling, you know, kind of unsatisfied with how things are going. And you could certainly say that for the traditional legacy media. And my argument would be that, in fact, these groups now have alternatives. You know, they have an alternative infrastructure. But what comes out is the dissonance, because there is still a mainstream discourse going on in BBC or in ARD or wherever. And as you could see, for instance, in Germany, the Pegida movement, this kind of right populist movement marching in the street, they have long been ignored by, you know, the traditional media, but yet they organized in Facebook. So if you kind of look at it from above, you see the dissonance, and you see that finally the established media cannot get around and taking up the issues and fueling at the same time the debate. So in a way, they make those claims legitimate by citing them, which sets off the spiral and clearly improves increases the problem. So, and this is exactly it, you know, that journalism cannot get around in finally turning to right populist Facebook movements, and yet they make the claims legitimate in a way. I mean, and one could also argue that it's nice to a certain degree, but it can only speak for Germany. I mean, if people marching in the streets with Nazi flags and, you know, calling for Merkel's hanging, I think this is a little bit over the top.
Other questions?
Thank you very much. I have a very basic and naive question. You mentioned networks and the role of them. And the first thing comes to my mind is a question that I've been thinking of for the last 3 years. And that is, when we opened up the internet to the public to produce knowledge, something like Wikipedia emerged. where people could contribute together and produce rather reliable source of information. And then when we took that to social media and allowed the same people to produce and disseminate information, we ended up with what we are dealing with, ecosystem of misinformation and joint news fake news. I can't quite get my head around what went wrong, that within a decade we went from Wikipedia to what we are at the moment. And I was wondering if you, I don't expect you to come up with a very clear answer because I know it's a rather open question, but I was wondering if you could help me to at least go to the right direction and answer this question.
Well, I think you talk about two sides of the same coin, you know. So, I mean, as if crowds can contribute to knowledge in a way, if they bring together their capacities and their wisdom on the one hand, but at the same time they can contribute to be just noisy when they contribute or when they shout up things that are not wise. So I think, you know, and I think it's a matter of perspective, because in early years we have only seen the positive sides, you know, the Wikipedia effects and the positive effects of networks and linkages and mobilizing for good causes, for a situation where this, Gary Wolfsfeld would say, a cumulative inequality in public attention to the elites, to what the elites say, can be counteracted in alternative spaces, in counterpublics, and in online issue networks of social movements, which we celebrate as, you know, pluralize the debate. But in a way, now the situation has changed, and it's not just the democratization. It's now also that you know, people who are not fighting for the good cause, if you want to put it this way, are using the same instruments to speak out publicly. So I think it's the same coin.
Okay, lady at the back.
So I want to touch base on the professionalization of journalism. And I was thinking of the concept brought up by Filipino journalist Maria Ressa, who spoke about journalism and communities of action, which is like the redefinition of journalism within very repressive governments as precisely the go-to person to filter what's information is good or not, right? But without a media house acting as exactly media, but it's just a direct relationship between the journalist and the people, and whether or not that could be something to look into for the future of journalism, like look into where democracy is not there and how that is being redefined. So it's wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, it's also the same thing that in authoritarian, thank you for coping with my heavy German accent. I mean, in countries where you had, you know, authoritarian structures, in the beginning it was quite a new chance that, you know, people, journalists had different outlets and had different arenas. So it was a celebration of new communication venues. But as you can see in Eastern Europe, the repressive governments also found out. So what we have now is information wars in very many parts of the world. So it's only this very short moment when fresh information is being publicized and finds now alternative venues. But we can see in many countries that after a very short time, even late journalism are oppressed to the same degree as in former times when there was press censorship. So in a way, the conflict has moved into another space, yet it's the same dynamics, unfortunately.
Come over this side.
Thank you for a very interesting collection of ideas that you put together. I guess my question as I listened to this was, I was thinking about Brexit in particular, since we're living through it right now. And one way of looking at Brexit is that there are a group of very noisy people who hate everything in continental Europe and are willing to attribute everything that's bad that they think that they can imagine to that, combined with some opportunistic politicians like Boris Johnson, for example, trying to play a particular role. And so what occurs to me is, why is this not just a story of political elites and division in political elites that we're seeing? We're not seeing a new competition system, we're just seeing some political elites that are deeply divided in terms of what they think the goal is. And I think you could tell the same story about Trump and many of the people around him, that there are, that's a political elite that has a particular point of view, and it is promoting that point of view extremely actively, and it's telling its story, it's using new media, it's using traditional media. But it's not a new story necessarily. It's a story we've seen for a long time. So tell me, what's your reaction to that thought?
I would think that it's a matter that the quality changes. The quality of the debate changes if there are, much more venues and much more outlets. I mean, without Twitter, Donald Trump's image and performance would be maybe be different, because he would not be able to circumvent traditional journalists all the time. So I don't know much about the British situation, so Boris Johnson and how he communicates. So I don't know whether if you imagine, have a thought experiment, and you imagine Boris Johnson or Donald Trump in the old world of mass media, how his communication would be and how the reaction of the people are.
Should we go to Bill right next to you, and then I'll take a couple of moments as well.
Okay, I'm sorry this corner is so loud. But thank you. I mean, really, I'm really impressed you're trying to deal with absolutely the most major issue we're all facing. But when I'm wrestling, I've looked at the civic culture as well, but obviously Alman Burba's book is criticized as just a description of the U.S. in the 1950s, and not really necessarily, I mean, it was tossed aside by everybody then, and but I also, why are we no longer civil? And then, but also the public sphere has never been accurate. I mean, that's always been romantic. So I mean, but your notion of the professional journalist caught me, because I think when you think of the professional journalists in the 60s, 50s, 60s, very little news. I mean, and it was and often criticized as being essentially so conservative and so managerial. Especially in the U.S., it was managerial in the sense that they would deal with the efficiency issues and not sensitive issues. And I think that maybe there's something there, and what you didn't mention is the issues that are now dealt with and given air in the new media. So we're dealing with issues of immigration and guns and abortion and these issues that cut so deeply, and I'm just wondering if these issues were ever given that much airing in the professional journalism of the 1950s and 60s, and you mentioned the economic disaster of the 2008 and after, and again it's the loss of jobs, the loss of serious displacement of people's status in the home and in society. So these issues are all given public airing now in a way that probably was never done by professional journalism in the good old days. And I'm wondering, is there something there in terms of the depth of the issues that are being covered and how serious they are and how the media reinforces those cleavages?
Well, I wouldn't argue that, you know, the issues are more serious than in the 50s, I mean, or in the 60s. Abortion has been around, you know, for many years as an issue, for instance. I mean, in Germany, the Notstandsgesetzgebung and everything in the 50s and 60s, I mean, there were quite conflicting issues. But I mean, what I was arguing was that there is a long value change. Therefore, I'm alluding to the political culture literature, because, I mean, I think I'm deeply convinced that it's not just the institution, it's the match of the institution and the values. And if we see that institutions like the party system have definitely changed and are no longer in the position of really capturing fundamental cleavages of society, so that new cleavages emerge of those who are abandoned from political elites, as you may say. I think we do have a difficult and a different situation now that we are arguing with Grisi and Hutter in a situation of deep political transformation, which we have to kind of recognize in a way, and this transformation is being enhanced, if you want to say so, in this communication, because it's no longer moderated by whatever you know, journalists who are responsive to norms. I mean, I'm speaking in this case as a German. Who, when we were really celebrating the British BBC model after the war as, you know, a public television that has an institution that doesn't belong to the state and doesn't belong to the party and doesn't belong to whoever, but is responsive to the people. So I think it does make a difference, and now there is a part of public sphere and public debate that is no longer holding to those norms. And together with the structural and cultural change, I mean, this is just a poisoned situation, I guess. That's all what I'm arguing. And as I said, it's hard to you know, make one factor responsible. That's the tricky part. Therefore, you have to collect the arguments and the theories and the approaches, and cannot really, you know, speak of causal relationships, which we would rather do as social scientists. I mean, maybe we can do it by some big data analysis in the future, but so far, I mean, we are just facing these challenges. That's all that I want to say. And if you look at the literature, you see the democracy literature, or you see the communication literature. And it's as if you are talking about two different things. And I think we urgently need to bring this together, and we need to theorize this. Maybe I've not done it in a perfect way, but I would urge students and young scholars to really move in this direction, because I think that's our duty as social scientists.
We started late, so I'm going to take two more questions if I can. Bring it here at the time. Chico, I'm sorry, I'm going to say particularly more going to work back to you, that's okay. I'm going to put you first in the queue to talk about after, that's all right. So can we have maybe both questions together? Yes. Is that right, Bob? And you can respond to both.
Hi, thanks. I come from the perspective of a professional journalist. In 2016, 2 years ago, I revived a 233-year-old newspaper as a digital publication. I agree with you that the business model, the journalism business model is changing, but I do think it's healthy for new entrants to play a larger role and the fact that the monopoly of the so-called legacy news media is broken is good. I'll give you a couple of examples. Intercept is a great example. For example, last year we won an award beating a legacy newspaper. I feel that democracy is strengthened by new entrants. And I also feel that there's a disjunct in the theoretical propositions. My question to you is this: with the overload of fake news that you can see, don't you think that there is a kickback from people wanting to seek authentic sources of information? Because from my personal experience, I see that our readership is dramatically increasing because we give them validated information that even traditional media houses are not giving. And we don't resort to any sort of populist, Breitbart kind of stuff. I mean, although I do think that it's a different perspective from ours.
Thank you. So that's the first question. We'll take one more from there.
I think I'm a bit of an insular, but I come from organisation scholarship, and I recognise very much the discursive contestation at the centre of this that you talk about, and see it as perpetually and recursively reproduced in the network society. I think that's come across really clearly. We would deconstruct this, of course, and I think my question to you is, what can we do as academics? What do you think our research programmes and our activism should be focused on?
Well, I think that the answer is to both questions is the same. I would never deny that there are good late journalists or good journalists operating on other platforms than legacy media. However, I mean, in professional journalism, we have norms and rules, and if the BBC or whoever, the Springer Press, writes a lie, we can hold them reliable. We can, we have a measure in our hands, and there are institutions to go back to them and prove them lies. I cannot do that with whatever pops up on social media. Yet, the mechanism of distribution of those messages is quite dynamic, and I cannot stop the process. And that's the difference, that there is rules and norms. I'm not defending whatever bad journalism is, but I'm defending a kind of information system that is based on some sort of accountability that we can bring to the fore. And this is no longer a given in whatever pops up in social media, be it true or false. And that's the same thing with research. What can we do? We can do our best in analyzing and observing and trying to be as good in our arguments and methodologies as we are. I mean, I would also not recommend us now starting a crusade against Facebook, right? But they are producing something that is public information, and that's a public good because it's our data they are commercializing on. So we also have to find ways to holding them accountable as we would hold The Guardian accountable if it publishes lies, or as if we. So I think this is our business. This is not much, but this takes a long breath. But I don't see another way.
Thank you very much. We've made you speak for a really long time, but I just thank you so much for the insightful and incredibly subtle and really sort of smoothly irrevocably formed lecture you've just given, as you say, in your second language. So please we show our appreciation for this wonderful lecture. Thank you.